She was born beneath chandeliers of gold and died beneath the gray stones of exile. Isabella of Bohemia, daughter of Poland's powerful queen Bona Sforza, was destined for crowns, not freedom. At 21, she stood beside her husband's coffin, holding a newborn heir and a kingdom already falling apart. Her life became a quiet war between empires that devoured her heart, her throne, and her name. She was born into the glittering heart of Renaissance Europe, a world of power, faith, and ambition disguised in silk. In the winter of 1519, inside the royal castle of Krakow, Isabella Jagiellon opened her eyes to a ceiling painted with angels. Her father, King Sigismund I the Old, ruled a flourishing Poland-Lithuania. Her mother, Queen Bona Sforza of Milan, was one of the most formidable women of her age, intelligent, ruthless, and determined to carve her name into the map of Europe. From the moment Isabella took her first steps, she was never truly her own. Her mother raised her not to dream, but to calculate. Lessons began before dawn: rhetoric, Latin, philosophy, theology, and the art of negotiation. Tutors whispered of virtue, but Bona taught her daughter the currency of survival: alliances, marriages, and signatures sealed with blood. A queen, she would say, must learn to smile while the world burns beneath her feet. In the candlelit corridors of Wawel Castle, Isabella grew into beauty that frightened courtiers. Too composed, too knowing. Poets called her the pearl of the Jagiellons. But Bona saw not a daughter. She saw a weapon. To her, Isabella was a living treaty, a bridge between crowns. The court gossip said she could quote Cicero, play the lute, and discuss military campaigns with ambassadors. But behind her quiet grace was a mind sharpened by maternal ambition. Europe around her was collapsing into chaos. The Reformation tore at the unity of Christendom. The Ottoman Empire pushed into the Balkans like an endless storm. And to the south, Hungary, once a mighty kingdom, had been shattered by the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, where its young king Louis II had drowned in flight from the Turks. Hungary became a bleeding wound between the Austrian Habsburgs and the Ottoman sultans. To most, it was a tragedy. To Bona Sforza, it was an opportunity. The Queen of Poland began plotting to extend her dynasty's reach southward. She wanted her daughter to be the queen of that fractured land, to plant Polish influence deep into the heart of Hungary. Diplomats came and went from Krakow, carrying secret letters and bribes. Isabella, still a teenager, was paraded before ambassadors like a prize to be weighed. Her worth was not in affection, but in her dowry, her lineage, and the armies her name might summon. At court, she watched her brothers prepare for military glory while her own destiny was confined to an inked page. One chronicler wrote, "The princess had eyes like rain, soft, but filled with knowing. She smiled when told she would soon be married to a man she had never met. She had no illusions. Royal daughters were not born to choose. They were born to be chosen." In 1539, the name of her husband-to-be was decided. King John Zapolya of Hungary, a warlord turned monarch who had spent his life fighting the Habsburgs for control of his kingdom. He was nearly 30 years older than Isabella, grizzled and scarred by campaigns, but still holding the crown through Ottoman support. For Bona, it was a perfect alliance. Poland would tie itself to Hungary and weaken Austria. For Isabella, it was the end of childhood. When she looked out from the castle balcony that last spring before her wedding, she saw the Vistula River glittering beneath the sun. The air smelled of lilies and melting snow. Her ladies whispered of love and destiny, but Isabella remained silent. She knew that the river flowed south, toward the Danube, toward Buda, toward the unknown life waiting for her beyond the border. Historians later found fragments of a prayer written in her hand before she left Krakow. Lord, make my duty bearable. Let my heart be still, even when it is sold. That summer, she departed Poland with a retinue of nobles, soldiers, and dowry wagons that rattled for miles. The people cheered as she passed through the city gates, calling blessings for the princess who would become a queen. But the sound of celebration could not drown out the hollow echo of farewell. Behind her, her mother watched from a window, smiling, victorious, but unblinking. As the caravan rolled southward, Isabella began to understand that her fate was not a wedding, but a campaign. Every embroidered gown packed in her trunks was a flag. Every jewel, a promise of loyalty. She was not traveling to a husband. She was being sent to occupy a throne for her mother's ambitions. By the time she reached Buda, war already loomed on the horizon. The city still bore the scars of Ottoman sieges, walls blackened, markets half empty, streets lined with soldiers rather than merchants. It was a kingdom held together by fear and memory. Yet even in this broken land, Isabella's presence was treated as a miracle. Bells rang and poets wrote that her arrival brought back spring to a wounded nation. She was 19, radiant in silver and white when she first met her husband, the man whose name had been written beside hers long before she could write her own. King John Zapolya bowed deeply before her, and she, as trained, curtsied with grace. Around them, courtiers cheered. But between them, there was silence. The silence of two lives bound not by affection, but by the gravity of kingdoms. That night, in her private chambers, Isabella stared at the embroidered map on her wedding tapestry. Poland, Hungary, Austria, and the vast lands of the Ottoman Sultan. Her fingers traced the borders that would one day erase her peace. In the candlelight, she whispered to herself, "My mother gave me a throne, not a life." And outside, beyond the palace walls, drums of war already trembled in the distance. The wedding of Isabella Jagiellon and King John Zapolya was a spectacle of fragile glory, a desperate attempt to crown love upon the ruins of a divided realm. In 1539, the bells of Buda rang over streets still smelling faintly of gunpowder. Trumpets blared. Banners fluttered with the red and white of Poland beside the black eagle of Hungary. But beneath the silk and ceremony, everyone knew this was not a union of hearts, but a pact born of fear. John Zapolya, gray at the temples and weary from decades of civil war, had taken the throne not by inheritance but by survival. He had been crowned after the death of Louis II, when Hungary's nobles chose him over the Habsburg claimant, Ferdinand of Austria. Yet his crown was a precarious gift, balanced upon the favor of the Ottoman Sultan, who saw in Zapolya a puppet to counter Habsburg power. By the time Isabella arrived, John was a king at war with half his country and at peace with none. Still, the marriage was celebrated as if peace itself had descended. Chroniclers wrote of silks from Venice, feasts that lasted 3 days, and golden cups overflowing with Tokaji wine. Isabella stood beside her husband, radiant and composed, her hair braided with pearls from the Adriatic. To the people of Buda, she looked like salvation itself, a princess from the north come to heal a wounded land. But even as vows were spoken, soldiers stood at the gates. Hungarian nobles watched the young bride with cold eyes, whispering of her foreign birth and her mother's influence. "She brings the north into our veins," one remarked bitterly. Perhaps the next crown will bear Poland's eagle instead of Hungary's cross. John, for his part, treated his new queen with respect, even tenderness. But theirs was a union built on necessity, not desire. He saw in her not a wife, but a bridge to legitimacy, a queen whose bloodline could secure his dynasty. To Isabella, he was the man her mother had chosen, a stranger whose touch meant duty, not affection. Yet she did not resent him. She understood too well the prison of kingship. Both were trapped in a theater of power that demanded obedience at the cost of intimacy. The months that followed were filled with both beauty and tension. Isabella adapted quickly to the Hungarian court, learning the language, receiving diplomats, writing letters in elegant Latin that impressed even her husband's wary advisors. Her intelligence became her armor. When the nobles tried to test her, she replied with calm wit that silenced them. "The queen," one wrote grudgingly, "has the wisdom of her mother, but the patience of her father." Yet outside the palace walls, the storm gathered. Ferdinand of Austria, claiming the Hungarian throne through marriage to Louis II's sister, declared John a usurper. Skirmishes erupted across the countryside. The Habsburg banners approached from the west. Ottoman emissaries from the east demanded loyalty. Isabella's new home was not a court, but a battlefield wearing a crown. Then, in the summer of 1540, a fragile joy pierced the tension. Isabella was with child. The news spread like wildfire. Bells rang again, and the people of Buda rejoiced, believing that an heir would finally unite the kingdom. John, old and ailing, clung to the hope that his son would carry the dream he could not fulfill. He ordered prayers and fasts in every church, declaring that the future of Hungary now rested within his queen's womb. But the fates were cruel. John's health deteriorated rapidly. Months of fever and exhaustion left him pale and trembling. He died on July 22, 1540, only days after receiving the news that his son had been born. He never saw the child. He never saw Isabella again. The chronicles say she was still in confinement when the court burst in with the news. The room smelled of candle wax and infant cries. A nurse laid the newborn beside her as a minister knelt to announce the king's death. Isabella's face did not move. She simply looked down at the infant, her child, now a king. Then quietly she said, "Let them come. The vultures will not wait for morning." Her prophecy was swift to come true. Within weeks, Ferdinand's armies marched toward Buda, declaring that a woman and a baby could not hold a throne. At the same time, envoys from the Ottoman Sultan arrived, offering protection, but at the price of submission. The Hungarian nobles split into factions. Some pledged loyalty to Ferdinand, others to Isabella in the name of her infant son, John Sigismund. The court became a nest of spies, each whisper heavier than the last. In her grief, Isabella showed neither tears nor hysteria. She summoned the Diet of Hungary and appeared before them veiled in black, her son in her arms. Chroniclers describe her voice as steady. "I am the mother of your king. His father is gone, but his blood remains pure. If Hungary must kneel, let it be before her own child, not before strangers." It was a moment that stunned even her enemies. They expected a widow. They found a monarch. For a time, she held the illusion of power. With Ottoman backing, her son was proclaimed John II, King of Hungary. But it was a title written in smoke. Ferdinand's generals advanced. The Ottoman army, sent to defend her, plundered as they protected. By autumn, Buda fell to the Turks. The city that had welcomed her with music now echoed with foreign boots and the cries of the displaced. In the chaos, Isabella fled with her infant, escorted by loyal soldiers through burned villages and rain-swept hills toward Transylvania. The road was lined with ruins, fields blackened, churches gutted, graves unmarked. She carried her son close, wrapped in what remained of her wedding veil. When she reached the mountains, she turned once to look back at the valley where her crown had turned to ashes. At 21, she was already a widow, a mother, and a queen without a kingdom. Later, in exile, she would write in her journal, "Love, war, and faith. They all demand the same sacrifice, yourself." And from that moment, Isabella ceased to be merely a consort. She became a survivor, a woman forged in the fire that consumed her throne. The kingdom Isabella had inherited through her infant son was no longer a country. It was a corpse that 3 empires were fighting to dissect. In the west, the Habsburg banners of Austria fluttered over fortress walls. In the east, the crescent standard of the Ottoman Sultan shimmered in the sun. And in between, Isabella and her baby son were stranded like ghosts, monarchs without a land. The death of John Zapolya had torn Hungary apart for the final time. The Diet of the Nobles fractured into rival councils, each declaring allegiance to a different master. One group proclaimed Ferdinand of Austria king in the name of civilized Europe. Another clung to Isabella and her son, believing loyalty to the Jagiellons might keep Hungary independent. The third group simply looked south, waiting for Ottoman gold to decide the matter. For Isabella, every day became a negotiation with survival. She held court in temporary palaces, her entourage reduced to a few loyal Hungarian lords and Polish advisors. The room smelled of smoke and damp wood. Her throne was a simple chair carved from pine. Yet she insisted on keeping the symbols of monarchy, a crown upon her table, a scepter at her side. Because they were all she had left. The war of letters began. From Vienna came stern demands. "Submit to Ferdinand, and your son shall live as a prince of the empire." From Istanbul came promises. "Bow to the Sultan, and your child shall rule in peace beneath our shadow." Isabella read both and burned both. To her council, she said, "I will not let my son inherit a borrowed crown." But she understood the trap. Without soldiers or gold, her words were worth only as much as her pride. In 1541, when Ottoman armies stormed Buda and seized control of central Hungary, the Sultan ordered that Isabella and her infant be protected, which in imperial language meant watched. She was escorted to Transylvania, a mountainous region still technically Hungarian, but now under Ottoman influence. It was far from the royal halls of Buda, yet it became her refuge, her prison, and her kingdom all at once. Transylvania, with its fog-wrapped valleys and fortified towns, became a court of exiles. Isabella ruled from Alba Iulia, a modest city ringed by forests and streams. Her courtiers called her Queen Mother. To the people she was the widow who would not kneel. There, among scholars and priests, she tried to rebuild a fragment of dignity. She reorganized administration, issued decrees in her son's name, and maintained correspondence with Polish and Hungarian nobles. In every letter she signed, she added the same closing line: "By the grace of God, Queen of Hungary." But grace was running thin. Ferdinand sent armies to reclaim the eastern provinces, declaring Isabella's regency illegal. His generals wrote to her with poisoned courtesy, offering safe passage if she would bring her son to Vienna to be raised as a Habsburg ward. Isabella refused. "My son was born a king," she answered, "not a hostage." Soon, Austrian troops encircled Transylvania. Ottoman messengers rode in from the south, demanding tribute in exchange for protection. Between them, Isabella stood like a lone figure on a chessboard where every square was already claimed. Her letters from that period reveal exhaustion and fury in equal measure. In one she wrote to her mother, Queen Bonisforza, "I am the queen of a child without a kingdom, of a people without a home. They write to me of treaties, but not of mercy." Her only comfort was her son, the small boy who carried the last spark of her late husband's hope. At night she would walk through the candlelit corridors of Alba Iulia, holding him close, whispering lullabies in Polish and Latin. The guards who saw her said she never smiled, yet her eyes softened when the child laughed. "He is all that is left of my empire," she once said, "and that is enough." Still, the empires did not rest. In Vienna, Ferdinand declared her reign an affront to order. In Istanbul, the Sultan demanded taxes she could not pay. Her counselors advised submission to one side or the other. But Isabella's pride, shaped by her mother's steel, would not bend. "Let me be crushed," she said, "but let my son stand free." In 1549, the inevitable came. A treaty was drafted, the so-called Treaty of Neerbator, that demanded Isabella surrender Transylvania and her son to Ferdinand in exchange for compensation. The Ottomans approved it. The Austrians celebrated it, and her own advisors begged her to accept. She signed it with trembling hands, writing, "For the safety of my son, I yield my crown, but I do not yield my soul." The day the Habsburg envoys came to take her child, witnesses described a silence that chilled the court. The boy, not yet 10, clung to his mother's dress as they approached. Isabella held him tightly, then lifted his face to hers. "Remember," she whispered, "you were born between storms. Never let them name you weak." When the soldiers led him away, she turned her back so they would not see her cry. Outside, rain began to fall, slow and heavy, as if the mountains themselves mourned. For months afterward, Isabella remained in her darkened chambers. Her ladies said she would sit by the window for hours, staring at the gray peaks. Her crown lay beside her, untouched, gathering dust. She was 30 years old and already carried the weight of a lifetime. Yet somewhere in the distance, a pulse of defiance still beat within her. The empires might have divided Hungary, but they had not conquered her. In the margins of one surviving letter, she wrote a line that historians still quote: "They have taken my land, my husband, and my son, yet I remain. Let them learn that a mother's silence is more dangerous than their swords." And so, Isabella waited, not in defeat, but in the stillness before resurrection. From the outside, Alba Iulia was a fortress surrounded by forests and rivers. But to Isabella, it was a heartbeat that refused to die. After being forced to surrender her crown in 1551, she found herself once again among the mountains of Transylvania, stripped of power, abandoned by her allies, and haunted by the echo of her child's footsteps in empty halls. The Habsburgs had taken her son, the Ottomans had taken her title, and Europe had taken her peace. But Transylvania, fierce, remote, unyielding, took her in. When Isabella first arrived, she rode through the city gates under a cold dawn sky. The townspeople knelt as she passed, their faces a mixture of pity and reverence. She no longer wore a crown. Her robes were simple, her jewels pawned to pay the servants. Yet something about her presence commanded loyalty. A noblewoman who witnessed that day wrote, "She looked not like a queen dethroned, but like one returned from purgatory to finish what the living could not." Her palace was modest, built of gray stone, sparsely furnished and damp with mountain air. Gone were the marble floors of Buda and the glittering courts of Krakow. Instead, she slept in a narrow bed beside parchment maps of a kingdom that no longer existed. Yet even in that isolation, Isabella refused to fade. She gathered around her the remnants of her husband's loyalists, scholars, priests, soldiers, and exiles who still believed in the dream of an independent Hungary. With their help, she began to rebuild. She restored the local mint to issue new coins bearing her son's name, strengthened the Transylvanian economy through trade with Moldavia and Wallachia, and founded schools to educate the children of nobles and peasants alike. For her, knowledge was a form of resistance. "If they take our swords," she said, "let us fight with books." Her court soon became known as a haven for intellect and faith. She welcomed Catholic theologians, Protestant reformers, and even humanist scholars fleeing persecution from the West. The air of Alba Iulia filled with debate and ink. Her secretaries copied classical manuscripts. Her chaplains printed books in Hungarian and Latin. Out of exile, Isabella built a tiny republic of the mind, a place where ideas could breathe even if freedom could not. The people began calling her Domina Transylvaniae, Our Lady of Transylvania. They brought her gifts of bread and wine, carved wooden toys for the absent prince, and prayers whispered through tears. She walked among them often, veiled and soft-spoken, offering coins to widows and food to the poor. For a land long abandoned by kings, the sight of a queen who stayed was a miracle. Yet the Habsburgs watched her closely. They did not trust the quiet mountains nor the widow who ruled them. Letters from Vienna called her a thorn in the empire's side. The imperial governor stationed nearby, Giovanni Battista Castaldo, wrote to Ferdinand warning that the queen's patience is more dangerous than her armies. He was right. Isabella's patience was not weakness. It was strategy. She played the game of diplomacy as her mother had taught her, waiting, listening, letting her enemies underestimate her. She sent letters to Polish nobles asking for mediation, to Moldavian princes seeking support, even to the Sultan's court in Istanbul. Each letter was written in elegant, deliberate Latin, signed Isabella de Gratia Regina Hungariae, Isabella by the grace of God, Queen of Hungary, as though to remind the world that she still was. But in the summer of 1551, the weight of empire descended again. Ferdinand's generals demanded that she leave Transylvania entirely and cede her territories to Habsburg control. They offered her compensation, the Polish city of Opole, a pension and safe passage. The choice was humiliation or annihilation. Isabella did not weep. She called her court together in the great hall of Alba Iulia, where cracked windows let in the chill of the Carpathian wind. Before nobles and clergy, she placed the royal seal upon the table and said quietly, "Take it, if it gives you peace. I will not sign my soul to their order, but I will spare my people another war." Outside, the bells tolled as if for a funeral. When she departed the city days later, the streets were lined with her subjects. Men removed their hats. Women wept openly. Some threw flowers before her carriage wheels. Others knelt in silence. Chroniclers wrote that Isabella looked out the window and pressed a hand to her chest, whispering, "They will remember I was not afraid." Behind her, the banners of the Habsburg army rose over Alba Iulia. Ahead of her stretched the long road north, through forests, rain, and heartbreak. Back to Krakow, the city of her birth. The journey took months. She traveled in near silence, her face pale beneath a mourning veil. Her servants noted that she carried with her only two treasures: a portrait of her late husband and a small golden cross. Everything else, she said, was only borrowed. When she crossed the border into Poland, no trumpets greeted her, only the quiet sound of hooves in the mud. Her homeland, once proud and familiar, now felt like another form of exile. Her mother, Queen Bona Sforza, welcomed her with tears but also bitterness. She saw in Isabella a reflection of her own failures. Power gained, power lost, all to the greed of men and crowns. That night, Isabella wrote in her diary, "I left Hungary not as a queen, but as its memory. They will build walls upon my footsteps, but the wind will carry my name back to the mountains." She was 32 years old, yet her eyes had the weight of 50. In losing her throne, she had found a strange freedom, the freedom of those with nothing left to take. And though the world thought her reign over, history was not finished with Isabella of Bohemia. The mountains she left behind would one day call her name again. And when they did, she would return not as a captive, but as a storm reborn. Krakow, the city of her birth, no longer felt like home. The same corridors that once echoed with laughter and royal music now carried only the weight of memories. When Isabella returned to Poland in 1551, she was greeted with ceremony but no warmth. To her mother, Bona Sforza, the sight of her daughter, pale, widowed, dethroned, was a wound to pride. "You have returned," Bona said, "but not as the queen I raised you to be." Their reunion was not the embrace of mother and child, but the meeting of two rulers who had both been betrayed by the world. Isabella had lost her crown to empires. Bona was watching her own kingdom rot beneath corruption and foreign influence. They sat together at the same table, but spoke like diplomats. Their affection had been tempered by ambition too long. In the dark chambers of Wawel Castle, Isabella became a shadow among the courtiers. She dressed in mourning black, her veil drawn low, her voice barely above a whisper. The court pitied her, yet also feared her. She was too quiet, too proud, the kind of woman whose silence could unsettle a room. One noble wrote, "She moves as if listening to ghosts." Still, she did not withdraw from duty. Her days were spent writing letters, hundreds of them, to bishops, envoys, and nobles across Europe. Each was a thread, an invisible web of diplomacy spun from exile. She pleaded for her son's safety in Vienna, negotiated for his return, and tried to keep alive the claim of the Zapolya dynasty. But no letter could reverse the laws of empire. Her appeals were politely acknowledged, then quietly ignored. In those years, Isabella's only companion was faith. Not the bright, triumphant faith of kings, but the dim, persistent one of a mother praying in silence. She spent long hours in the chapel, the candles trembling against the draught. Some said they heard her murmuring in Latin, others that she wept without sound. And then, one winter night, the letter arrived. A messenger, cloaked in snow, brought it from Italy. The wax seal bore the Sforza crest, her mother's emblem. The letter was short, almost blunt. "The Queen of Poland, Bona Sforza, has been poisoned." The details came slowly, through whispers and rumors. Bona had been betrayed by her own Italian steward, Gian Lorenzo Papacoda, who had conspired with Spanish agents to steal her fortune and silence her. The once feared queen had died in agony, alone, far from home. When Isabella broke the seal and read the words, she did not scream. Witnesses said she stood still, the parchment trembling slightly in her hands. After a long moment, she whispered, "Even the strong are not safe." when the weak want their crowns. She ordered no public mourning, no black banners, no funeral processions. Instead, she locked herself in her chambers for 3 days and nights. When she emerged, her face was calm, but her eyes were no longer young. That night, she walked alone through the courtyard of Wawel Castle. Snow fell in thick, soft flakes. The torches hissed as they burned. She looked up at the sky and said quietly to a servant, "I am my mother's daughter, but I will not die her death." From that moment, something hardened within her. Exile had turned her sorrow into resolve. She began to gather information from Transylvania, secret letters from loyal nobles, reports of unrest under Habsburg rule, whispers that the Ottoman Sultan was preparing to challenge Austria again. The mountains that had once been her prison were stirring. While Europe prepared for yet another wave of wars, Isabella prepared her soul for return. She studied maps again, traced the routes of the rivers that connected Krakow to Transylvania, and met discreetly with diplomats from the east. She refused to be written out of history. "A mother's duty," she said, "does not end with the loss of her child. It begins there." Still, the years dragged on. She lived modestly, refusing the luxuries of court life. Her servants noted that she ate little, often staring into the distance while others dined. She wrote poetry in her margins, verses about mountains, loss, and God's silence. One fragment survives. "The crown I lost was made of gold. The crown I wear is made of grief. But both are heavy, and both command the same bow." As her hair turned silver, Isabella became a living ghost in the Polish court, an exile among her own blood. Yet in her stillness, she watched the empires shift like tectonic plates. By 1556, the Ottomans launched new campaigns against Austria. The balance of power trembled. Suddenly, letters arrived from Transylvania, desperate, pleading. The Habsburg garrisons had become tyrannical. The nobles begged her to return, to reclaim the regency in her son's name. It was as if history itself had turned back to her. When Isabella read those letters, she did not smile. She simply closed her eyes, then said, "God has a strange mercy. He breaks us so we may fit his design." Her decision was made in silence. In the spring of 1556, she gathered her household, mounted her horse, and began the long ride south, back through forests, rivers, and ruins she knew too well. The people along the roads watched as she passed. A woman once royal, now spectral, wrapped in black furs, carrying not jewels, but letters of return. She looked neither right nor left. To one witness, she seemed like a soul walking home through the ashes of her own life. Behind her, Krakow's towers disappeared into the mist. Ahead of her, the Carpathian peaks glimmered faintly under the sun. Cold, sharp, eternal. And in that moment, Isabella of Bohemia, the widow, the mother, the exile, began her slow resurrection. When Isabella crossed the Carpathians again in 1556, it was as though the mountains themselves were exhaling after years of holding their breath. The valleys she had once left in tears were now scarred by war. Villages burned, churches shattered, rivers clogged with driftwood and bones. Yet when word spread that the Queen was returning, people poured from their homes as if dawn had finally broken after a decade of darkness. They called her name in 3 languages, Polish, Hungarian, and Latin, their voices echoing through the cold passes. "Welcome back, our mother, our queen." Isabella rode not in triumph, but in quiet endurance. She wore black fur over a plain gown, her once raven hair streaked with silver. The journey from Krakow had taken weeks, But she never faltered. Her entourage was small: loyal retainers, clerics, and a few soldiers who had followed her even in exile. She carried no treasure, no crown, only a letter of safe conduct from the Sultan, whose armies had once again pushed the Habsburgs out of Transylvania and demanded her reinstatement as regent. When she reached the city of Alba Iulia, the bells that had once tolled for her departure now rang again for her return. The streets were lined with candles and tears. Some knelt, others threw flowers before her horse. Chroniclers wrote that she dismounted, kissed the ground, and whispered, "Home, though never mine." The palace she entered was half ruined. Dust hung in the air, ivy climbed the outer walls, and broken glass glinted like frost on the floors. Yet she walked its corridors as if they were sacred ground. The ghosts of her past followed her, the echoes of farewell, the cries of her people from years before. But this time she did not weep. She had come not as a widow of a lost king, but as the mother of one who still could be. Her son, John Sigismund, was now a boy of 15. Thin, curious, and serious beyond his years, he had been raised among tutors and guards who spoke more of loyalty than of love. When Isabella saw him again, she froze for a heartbeat. Then she stepped forward, cupped his face in her hands, and said softly, "You have your father's eyes?" He answered, "And your will, mother." The court chronicler wrote, "They embraced not as strangers, but as those who had been dreaming of each other in separate prisons." Together, they began the difficult work of rebuilding. The regency was restored in her name, but Isabella knew it was an illusion granted by Ottoman power. The Sultan had no love for freedom. He needed her to keep Transylvania loyal to Istanbul. The Habsburgs, humiliated but not defeated, lurked across the western border. She was caught again between the two giants that had ruined her youth. Still, she governed with remarkable skill. From 1556 onward, Isabella devoted herself to restoring the region's stability. She reinstated local nobles who had been exiled, reopened trade routes, and ordered the reconstruction of monasteries and schools destroyed in war. Her court became once more a place of learning and tolerance, a fragile island of peace in a continent sinking into religious conflict. She invited Lutheran and Calvinist scholars to debate with Catholic theologians under her patronage. "Let every man's soul find its own path to God," she said. In an age when Europe bled over doctrine, her words were nothing short of heresy or prophecy. Centuries later, historians would see in her rule the roots of the Edict of Torda, the first legal decree of religious freedom in Europe, signed by her son years after her death. Yet Isabella herself had no peace. The years of exile had carved deep furrows into her body. She often coughed blood, her nights restless with fever. She hid her pain from her son, continuing to preside over councils and audiences until her hands trembled too violently to hold a quill. She still signed her letters the same way she had in Krakow: Isabella, by the grace of God, Queen of Hungary. It was no longer a claim, it was defiance. Even her enemies could not help but respect her endurance. The Habsburg envoy wrote to Vienna, "She is made of iron and smoke. She cannot be crushed." In the evenings, she would sit by the palace balcony, watching the torches flicker along the fortress walls. From there, she could see the mountains, black against the dying sky, and the faint shimmer of the river Maros. Sometimes she spoke softly to herself, as though conversing with the ghosts of her past, her husband, her mother, the girl she once was. One of her attendants recorded a fragment of what she said one night. When I left, I was a queen without a country. When I returned, I found a country without a queen. So I became both, until I vanish. Her reign in Transylvania was short but luminous. She revived its treasury, reformed its governance, and, most importantly, gave her people a sense of belonging again. But her strength came at a cost. By 1559, Isabella's health had deteriorated beyond recovery. Physicians prescribed rest, herbs, prayers. None helped. Her once steady voice began to falter, her steps grew unsteady, yet she refused to leave her post. "The body can die," she told her council, "but duty does not." As summer turned to autumn, she became visibly frail. Those who saw her in her final months described a woman still regal, though hollowed by years of endurance. Her son, now 16, often read to her at night from the Psalms. Sometimes she would interrupt him with a smile and whisper, "You will be greater than your father, if you do not let the world break you." She had returned from ashes, rebuilt a realm, and prepared her son to inherit it. But she knew she would not see him crowned. By September, she confined herself to her chambers, too weak to rise. Outside, the leaves began to fall, and the bells of Alba Iulia tolled more softly, as if the city already sensed its queen was slipping away. And so, in the same place where she had lost everything years before, Isabella of Bohemia found her ending. Not in defeat, but in peace carved from pain. She had returned to the mountains that had buried her name and resurrected it. The autumn of 1556 had crowned Isabella once more, not with gold, but with endurance. Yet by 1558, the crown she wore began to crack under the weight of years and wounds. 3 winters in Transylvania had turned her from a queen restored into a woman consumed by duty. The courtiers saw her strength. Only her physicians saw the trembling beneath her gloves. Each morning, she still walked through the palace corridors at Alba Iulia, her veil trailing behind her like a dark flame. She presided over councils, signed decrees, and reviewed letters sent from Poland, Moldavia, and the Ottoman court, but her servants whispered that sometimes, when the doors closed, she coughed into her hands and left stains of blood on her handkerchiefs. She would fold them carefully, hide them beneath her sleeves, and return to her desk. Her rule, though brief, was one of vision. Isabella knew that Transylvania could not survive as a vassal state forever. She began drafting reforms that would loosen the region's dependence on both Vienna and Istanbul. Taxes were adjusted to favor farmers and merchants. Foreign mercenaries were replaced with local soldiers loyal to her and her son. She strengthened trade with Polish and Wallachian markets and negotiated the reopening of mines long abandoned during wars. When foreign envoys accused her of defiance, she smiled and said, "Peace cannot be built on obedience. It must be built on dignity." Her greatest achievement, however, was not written in ledgers, but in hearts. She demanded tolerance. After years of religious war tearing Europe apart, Catholics burning Protestants, Protestants burning Catholics, Isabella decreed that no man in her territories would be persecuted for his faith. Her chancellor protested, warning that such leniency would anger both Rome and Istanbul. She replied, "God has enough judges. The rest of us must learn mercy." These words would outlive her. Decades later, her son would sign the Edict of Torda, the first legal act of religious freedom in Europe, a seed planted by a dying mother who believed that faith was not a weapon, but a bridge. But in 1559, that mother's body began to fail her. The long years of stress, the poison of grief, the endless winters, all had taken their toll. Chroniclers describe her face as pale as parchment, her lips cracked from coughing, her frame thin as a reed. Yet when she entered the audience chamber, no one dared show pity. "The queen still walks as if her spine were made of iron," one diplomat wrote. At night she grew weaker. She would wake coughing violently, the candlelight flickering over her bed. Her ladies would rush to her side, but she would raise a trembling hand to stop them. "Do not call for priests," she whispered. "I am not dying, only remembering." Her son, John Sigismund, now 16, refused to leave her side. He read to her from the scriptures, from Cicero, even from her own letters written years earlier. Sometimes she smiled faintly, sometimes tears filled her eyes. "I had forgotten that I once wrote with such hope," she said one evening, before the ink turned to sorrow. But the affairs of the realm could not stop. Even in sickness, Isabella summoned her council. She listened to disputes between nobles, approved new trade charters, and even dictated diplomatic responses to the Ottoman court. She signed each document in shaky handwriting, determined that no one else would bear her seal. When her physician begged her to rest, she answered, "A queen rests when the world no longer needs her, and the world has never needed women more." It was this will, this refusal to surrender, that terrified her enemies most. Vienna called her the Iron Widow. Istanbul, with grudging respect, referred to her as the Northern Lioness. But within her chambers, the Iron Widow wept. She knew that death was near. Every sunset felt heavier, as if the world itself were dimming with her breath. In early September 1559, the bells of Alba Iulia tolled softly for evening prayers. Isabella, too weak to walk, was carried to the balcony overlooking the courtyard. The air was cool, scented with pine and the faint smoke of hearth fires. Her son stood beside her, holding her hand. "Look," she whispered, pointing to the horizon where the mountains burned gold in the dying light. "Even the earth wears its crown before night." She turned to him, her eyes wet but unwavering. "You were born between empires," she said. "Never let them make you a servant. Rule with mercy, for your mother's blood has watered this land." That night, her fever worsened. The court gathered in hushed silence. Priests prayed, candles flickered, and Isabella, breathing shallowly, murmured half-formed prayers in Latin and Polish. Her last command was simple, that her son be crowned not with splendor, but with wisdom. At dawn, she asked to see him one final time. The boy knelt at her bedside, clutching her hand. She smiled faintly, her fingers tracing the sign of the cross on his forehead. "You will live for both of us," she said. "And when they speak of me, tell them I was not afraid." Minutes later, her breathing slowed. The morning light filtered through the window, catching the edges of her face like a halo. Then, with one final exhale, soft as a sigh, Isabella of Bohemia was gone. Outside, the first bells of morning mass began to ring. The courtiers and servants fell to their knees. Some wept openly. Others simply bowed their heads, knowing that an age had ended. They buried her in the cathedral at Alba Iulia, beneath a plain marble slab engraved with a single line: "Isabella Regina, non victa, non vita." Queen Isabella, unconquered though undone. She had ruled not with armies, but with endurance. Her crown was cracked, her heart broken, but her will, her faith in the dignity of her people, remained iron until the last breath. And so the queen, who once lost everything, left behind the only thing she had ever truly possessed: courage. The palace of Alba Iulia lay in silence. Outside, the wind drifted through the courtyard like a soft hymn. Inside, the corridors were lit only by candles, each flame bending gently toward the dying queen's chamber. It was September 1559, and the city that had once echoed with her commands now whispered prayers for her soul. Isabella of Bohemia lay upon a narrow bed of carved oak. The walls around her were lined with faded tapestries, scenes of saints, battles, and vanished empires. Her once bright eyes were dimmed, her breath thin as the silk sheets drawn over her chest. Yet her mind remained clear. Death had courted her for months, but she was not afraid. She had outlasted kingdoms. What was there left to fear in the quiet hand of God? Her son, John Sigismund, stood beside her, his face pale in the candlelight. He was 15, newly crowned in name but not yet in spirit, a boy on the threshold of destiny. The courtiers and priests hovered at the doorway, unwilling to intrude on a farewell both sacred and human. "Come closer," she whispered, her voice almost lost in the crackle of wax. He knelt, taking her hand. It was cold, fragile like parchment. She smiled faintly. "You were born into war," she said, "but may you rule in peace. I have given you all that I had: blood, sleep, hope. Promise me you will not let hatred inherit this throne." "I promise," he whispered. She closed her eyes, nodding. "Then my life was not wasted." A priest stepped forward to offer last rites, but she waved him away. "God knows my heart," she murmured. "I have spoken to him too often to need witnesses." As the night deepened, thunder rolled in the distance. The air smelled of rain and pine. Somewhere in the hills, wolves howled, their cries faint and sorrowful, as though the wilderness itself mourned. Isabella's attendants sat at her feet, silently weeping. The youngest among them, a girl who had come from Krakow years before, clutched her rosary until her fingers bled. The queen turned her head slightly, her eyes soft with compassion. "Do not cry," she said gently. "Queens die as others do, only slower." She asked to see the window open. The chill wind entered, carrying the scent of wet earth. She breathed deeply, as if to drink the world one last time. "This is how freedom smells," she said. "Cold, honest." Her confessor whispered, "Your Majesty, is there anything you wish to confess?" Isabella smiled faintly. "Only that I loved too fiercely what the world wished to destroy. My child, my country, my own name." She paused, her eyes distant. "Perhaps that was my sin, but I would commit it again." The rain began to fall. Each drop struck the roof like the ticking of a slow clock. The queen's breathing grew shallower. John Sigismund leaned closer, tears streaking his face. "Mother," he said softly, "don't leave me yet." She turned her head, her lips forming a faint, tired smile. "I will not," she whispered. "So long as you remember me, I remain." Her hand trembled as she reached for the crucifix on her chest. "Rule with mercy, my child," she murmured, her final lesson, her final order. "For your mother's blood has watered this land." The priest began to recite prayers for the dying. But as he spoke, Isabella's eyes drifted beyond him, fixed on something unseen, something luminous. Her expression softened into peace. A final breath escaped her lips like a sigh carried by the wind. When the last candle flickered out, dawn had already touched the mountains. Outside, the city stirred. The bells of Alba Iulia tolled not for a coronation this time, but for a requiem. Their sound rolled through the valley like the voice of a mourning god. People gathered in the streets, peasants, nobles, priests, all standing in the rain. None spoke. They simply bowed their heads, as if afraid to break the silence she had left behind. The funeral was held 3 days later. Her body, dressed in simple black silk, was laid in a marble coffin. The crown of Hungary, the one she had once worn, was placed at her feet, cracked, dulled, symbolic of the price she had paid. Her son walked behind the coffin barefoot, by his own wish. The procession wound through the streets of Alba Iulia, through mud and prayer, until it reached the cathedral. Inside, the chants of the monks rose like wings of smoke. The incense hung heavy in the air. When the coffin was lowered into the crypt, John Sigismund placed his hand on the lid and whispered, "You will not be forgotten." The bishop pronounced her title one final time, Isabella Dei Gratia Regina Hungariae, Isabella, by the grace of God, Queen of Hungary. And for a moment, even her enemies bowed. Outside, the storm cleared. Sunlight broke through the clouds, falling across the cathedral steps. Some swore they saw the shape of a dove circling above the tower. Others said it was only the light. But for those who believed, it was her, the spirit of the queen who had endured betrayal, exile, and war, now finally free. That evening, John Sigismund stood alone in his mother's chambers. Her books still lay open on the desk, her letters half finished, her seal beside them. The scent of wax and lavender lingered in the air. He touched the empty chair where she had once ruled and whispered, "You are still here." Then he looked out the window at the mountains she had loved, their peaks glowing gold under the dying sun for the first time since her death. He smiled through his tears. He understood then that Isabella's power had never come from thrones or treaties, but from endurance. The courage to keep standing when history itself tried to erase her. And so, in the stillness of that final evening, the mountains kept their vigil, and the wind carried her name softly through the valley. Isabella, the queen who never surrendered, even to death. After Isabella's death, Transylvania mourned not as a province losing its regent, but as a people losing their mother. Her coffin had been sealed beneath the marble floor of the Alba Iulia Cathedral, yet her presence refused to fade. For months, the scent of candle smoke and lavender still clung to the corridors of her palace. Servants swore that when they passed her chambers at dusk, they could still hear the faint scratching of her quill, as if she continued writing decrees from beyond the veil. But it was her son, John Sigismund Zapolya, who carried her true legacy. At 15, he had knelt by her deathbed a boy. By 16, he rose as a prince shaped by her ghost. He had inherited no empire, no army strong enough to challenge Vienna or Istanbul. Only her wisdom, her patience, and her belief that compassion could be stronger than conquest. The Ottomans recognized him as Prince of Transylvania, and the Habsburgs, too exhausted by wars, reluctantly accepted his rule over the eastern lands. Yet both empires waited for his failure. They saw him as a child surrounded by advisors, a puppet whose strings would soon tangle. What they did not see was the invisible armor his mother had left him, the discipline of endurance and the fire of mercy. In the first years of his rule, John Sigismund governed as Isabella had taught him, with restraint, intelligence, and tolerance. The same palace that had witnessed her suffering became the heart of a new political vision, one that would defy the darkness of its age. He kept his mother's advisors close, preserved her policies, and even continued the charitable works she began. When the peasants came to the castle gates seeking justice, they were received with respect. "The queen taught me that no man's voice is too small," he told his council. But the true reflection of Isabella's legacy shone brightest in his handling of faith. Across Europe, the fires of the Reformation burned without mercy. Cities in Germany and France bled in the name of doctrine. The Inquisition swept through Spain. Protestants were executed in England. Lutherans and Calvinists hunted each other in the Low Countries. Only in Transylvania, a small fragile land between empires, did a miracle unfold. In 1568, John Sigismund summoned his nobles, clergy, and scholars to the Diet of Torda. The air was thick with tension. Priests from 4 different confessions stood side by side, ready to argue their truths. The young prince rose before them, calm and deliberate. His speech echoed the tone of his mother, not fiery, but firm. "No man shall be reviled for his faith," he declared. "No one shall compel another to believe as he does. For faith is the gift of God, and compulsion makes hypocrites, not believers." The room fell silent. In an age when kings still ordered executions over scripture, his words were revolutionary. The Edict of Torda, signed that year, became the first legal decree of religious freedom in Europe. Historians would later call it a candle lit in a continent of darkness. But those who knew Isabella whispered a different truth. It was her voice, speaking through her son. Even his enemies admitted it. The Austrian ambassador wrote bitterly to Vienna, "The sun rules by the counsel of the dead queen. Her spirit still governs these mountains." John Sigismund's reign was brief and burdened by conflict, yet it carried the fragrance of his mother's ideals. He refused to persecute Catholics despite pressure from Protestant lords. He invited Muslim merchants from Ottoman lands to trade freely in Transylvanian markets. He corresponded with humanist scholars in Italy, speaking of tolerance as the true crown of mankind. When asked where he had learned such restraint, he would simply reply, "From a woman who lost everything, yet kept her honor." Among the people, Isabella's name became legend. They spoke of her as a Sabadsag Anya, the mother of freedom. Ballads were sung of her courage and exile, of how she had returned from ashes to restore peace. Old women lit candles on her death day. Children were told, "She watches the mountains still." Her tomb became a place of quiet pilgrimage. Travelers wrote of villagers kneeling there, pressing their hands to the cold marble and whispering prayers not for miracles, but for strength. "Grant us the courage of the queen," they said. Over time, even the scholars who once doubted her came to see her true place in history. A chronicler from Vienna, long after her death, wrote, "We thought her a pawn, yet she played as a queen. She held no sword, yet kingdoms bent to her endurance." In Krakow, decades later, a chronicler rediscovered her letters, pages filled with ink faded to sepia. They revealed a woman who had loved fiercely, grieved deeply, and reasoned with kings as an equal. One note, unsigned but unmistakably hers, read, "Let them call me weak because I am a woman. I have seen the weak survive what the mighty cannot." John Sigismund would die young as his mother had, before his 30th year. Yet he left behind a Transylvania unlike any other realm of its time, a land of coexistence, learning, and fragile peace. Historians call him the philosopher prince, but in truth, he was simply his mother's son. Together, their names became one in the memory of the land. Isabella and John, mother and child, seed and flower. She had given him life twice, once in birth and once in example. In the centuries that followed, when empires rose and fell, When new kings ruled and old faiths clashed again, the legend of the queen who ruled from exile never vanished. In folk tales and church hymns, she remained what she had always been, a light that refused to go out. And in the cold cathedrals of Alba Iulia, where her marble tomb still rests beneath the echo of bells, the faithful still whisper her name, softly, reverently, as though afraid to wake her. Isabella, mother of Transylvania. Centuries have passed since Isabella's candles burned out in the palace of Alba Iulia. The empires that crushed her have fallen to dust, their borders redrawn by the hands of time. Yet her name, faint but unbroken, still drifts through the valleys of Transylvania like a prayer carried by wind. She lies buried far from Krakow, far from the marble halls where her story began. No crown rests upon her tomb, only a simple carving, Isabella Regina. But in that silence, she has become something rarer than a ruler, a symbol of endurance. For Isabella of Bohemia was never meant to conquer. She was meant to survive, to hold her child in a crumbling palace and still whisper of mercy, to lose her throne, her mother, her youth, and still rule with grace. The world remembers kings who built empires with swords, but history, in its quiet wisdom, remembers her, the queen who built peace from ruins and whose courage outlasted her crown.